The president goes on to say, this time we must actually do something, conscience and common sense. I want to bring in my colleague, Mike Viqueira, our bureau chief in Washington, D.C. Mike, did this speech feel any different than the ones before, after Columbine, after Parkland, after Parkland, after Sandy Hook? There are too many to name because there have been that many just in the last few years.
Right, and if you've covered the efforts for gun restrictions in the wake of those unspeakable shootings, you learn to be a little bit pessimistic about these drives in Congress, Marnie, to pass new gun laws, new gun restrictions. I would say after this speech and after what we've seen and heard over the course of the last week, and of course it took those 3 ghastly shootings consecutively to move people off the mark, there does seem to be a glimmer of hope, if you do favor gun restrictions, that something is going to move. And I thought perhaps the most significant part of the president's speech was he laid out the middle ground, a portion of the, where he could find compromise, where Democrats were going to have to prepare. Instead of absolutes that we have to have an assault weapons ban, that we have to have expanded background checks, that we have to ban bump stocks, and everything else that we have heard over the course of the last 10 or 20 years, Marnie, the president's fallback position on banning assault weapons. And remember, in 1994, when Senator Joe Biden was leading the Judiciary Committee, he had that ban. He was instrumental in instituting that ban, which expired after 10 years. But now, instead of re-upping that fight, picking up that baton has been picked up so many times in the past, now he's saying, well, the fallback can be, let's at least raise the minimum age for buying an assault weapon or a semi-automatic weapon. There's a lot of debate over what exactly an assault weapon is, from 18 to 21. Also talking about the red flag laws, which are instituted in many states already around the country, and which some conservative senators have already said or signaled that they could support. That is something. If you have showed a troubled past, a history of violence, or perhaps mental illness, then you would have a so-called red flag and be unable or prohibited from buying a firearm. These are the areas of compromise, and if there's going to be success on the part of Democrats and of course part of President Biden and the part of Republicans who do favor some of these new restrictions, that is going to be the territory. So the president, very significantly, Marnie, not laying out absolutes in terms of what he wants and will not settle for anything less, but there appears to be an emerging middle ground now.
Mike, he also made a point to address responsible gun owners. Let's listen.
For so many of you at home, I want to be very clear. This is not about taking away anyone's guns. It's not about vilifying gun owners. In fact, we believe we should be treating responsible gun owners as an example of how every gun owner should behave.
Mike, important to point out, the president said in order to do this and the other measures he is proposing, we need a minimum of 10 Republican senators to get on board. What are you hearing after Uvalde, after all of these other mass shootings, in terms of those who are willing from the other side, from the GOP, to come to the negotiating table and find some compromise here?
Right. This is the filibuster that we heard about. It takes 60 of 100 senators. There are 50 Democrats now, leaving 10 Republicans that have to go along to break a filibuster on new gun restrictions to pass Congress. And the Senate has always been the problem. I remember 10 years ago, I was standing outside the Senate chamber in the wake of Sandy Hook when everyone thought there was going to be a renewal of the assault weapons ban at an absolute minimum. And then Senator Dianne Feinstein, as it happens, I was standing with a small clutch of reporters. She told us on her way into a meeting it wasn't going to happen. It was breaking news. No one could believe it, especially after the ghastly, unspeakable events that happened at Sandy Hook. So there is still some pessimism and well-earned pessimism in Washington about whether any of this can happen. But the president does need the Senate to go along. You know, the Senate is institutionally biased towards rural states. I mean, that's just a fact of the matter that is not going to change. That has been true for the history of the Republic. And it's not as much of a Republican-Democrat issue as everything else is, but it is a rural-urban issue as well. So the Senate is always the problem. There are talks underway now, a bipartisan group of senators, Chris Murphy from Connecticut, where Sandy Hook took place, John Cornyn from Texas, home of Uvalde, of course, where that massacre, that horrible shooting took place in a school there. So 2 senators from states that have seen unthinkable shootings in elementary schools leading these talks. Mitch McConnell has tasked, the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, has tasked John Cornyn with doing this. The trouble is that normally the playbook is to let the furor die down, and then sooner or later, the drive for these restrictions goes away. The political impetus, the political capital is simply not there. The trouble with that strategy this time is that people keep walking into grocery stores, into elementary schools, into hospitals, and committing these mass atrocities. And so there does seem to be, even though there are no guarantees there's going to be a breakthrough in terms of an agreement on any kind of new gun restrictions, there does seem to be a little bit more momentum than there would ordinarily be when we're talking about this kind of legislation. We're talking about the Second Amendment, Marnie.
Mike, I want to play one more soundbite from the president talking about raising the age limit from 18 to 21 on the purchase of some of these guns. Listen.
Right.
We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And if we can't ban assault weapons, then we should raise the age to purchase them from 18 to 21. Strengthen background checks. Enact safe storage law and red flag laws. Repeal the immunity that protects gun manufacturers from liability. Address the mental health crisis.
And that last part, Mike, address the mental health crisis. I think you couple that with what he said. That's what's new about this time, and the amount of young people that we find who have these types of weapons, who are committing some of these crimes. Sandy Hook one, Uvalde the second. That is new, something we haven't heard from these speeches before.
Well, and the mental health crisis among young adults is an issue that is becoming bigger and bigger in this country. And I think that was actually an overture towards Republicans, because we do hear Republicans in the wake of the shootings, these past recent 3 shootings, talk about mental health as an issue, as a way of saying it's not the guns, it's the mental health. So I think that the president was essentially reaching out to Republicans. But just after that, I thought it was an interesting thing that he said, if Congress fails, and this, he sort of gave away the game on the politics of this. If Congress fails, that he encouraged people to go to the ballot box in November. Of course, the midterm elections, when every member of the House of Representatives and the third of the Senate is up for re-election, go to the ballot box and vote your will when it comes to, or your frustrations when it comes to these gun restrictions. Whether that happens remains to be seen. But you're right. You know, the president sort of gave away his middle ground there. That's his negotiating position. I thought it was very clever. He says, I want that assault weapons ban, but I'll settle for raising the age to purchase an assault weapon, a so-called assault weapon, from 18 to 21. So a fascinating way that he put that argument together, I thought, and it was largely an effective speech from any objective standpoint. I think it was different than what we've heard past presidents talk about in the wake of these tragedies and the call for gun restrictions from the White House, Marty.
And a call for the American people to take some action as well, especially when it comes to their votes come November. I'm Mike Viqueira in D.C. tonight. As always, thank you, Vic. Thank you for watching. Go to NewsNationNow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.